Good morning. Thank you for tuning in. This morning we'll start chapter 6 of the Gospel of Luke. So if you've got a Bible, go ahead and turn to Luke chapter 6, where we'll get started in this really powerful chapter, where later on we will see Jesus preach the Sermon on the Mount. But we can't get there before Jesus having a run-in with the Pharisees, which is going to become quite common. But before we jump into the story, have you ever been enjoying a nice, peaceful, rare moment of tranquility, of relaxation, when all of a sudden that moment of peace was interrupted? Whether it was by a knock on your door, a telephone ringing, or somebody comes into the room and just kind of bursts your little bubble of rest. I have this little space of time in the morning when I get up. I try to get up earlier than everybody else so that I can make a cup of coffee and settle into my chair and just do a little bit of reading and a little bit of praying. That's my brief moment of rest in the mornings before inevitably one of the kids wakes up and comes into the room. And then I can kind of kiss my chances of resting and reading goodbye. Now, of course, I love that interruption because it means that Tristan or Quali is going to come spend some time sitting on my lap, or Shannon is going to come in and talk to me. But the point is that rest is something that I value because it's not always easy to find. Rest is something that I value, and I'm sure you too. I'm sure you value it also. It's something that we value because it's not always easy to find. Well, the Jewish people, from the time that they received the law, they were to also value and cherish a special time of rest known as the Sabbath day. And so the Sabbath day, it started at sundown on Friday and lasted until nightfall on Saturday. And the word Sabbat or Sobat literally meant to decease, to cease, to desist, to rest, and just to stop doing anything. And so the concept of Sabbath actually finds its meaning all the way back in Genesis, when God created everything in 6 days, but on the seventh day, he rested. He ceased from creating and he rested. And that's where the original concept of Sabbath comes from. So the law would command the Jewish people to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So let's read Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11 to kind of get a good understanding of what Sabbath was kind of about, a picture of what it meant to the Jewish people. So Exodus 20, 8 through 11 says this: "Remember the Sabbath day and by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, or any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." So Sabbath, then, it wasn't just about resting from work, resting from producing, resting from creating. It was about taking a day, a space, a time, and saying, this is going to be to the Lord. We're going to recognize that this is a day that we're setting aside for the Lord. And so in reality, It was about their relationship with God. It wasn't just about rest for the body. In some way, it was about rest for the soul. It wasn't just a time to stop working. It was a time to start resting in God's presence. And so it was kind of an invitation to recognize that God is sovereign. And so what we have, it comes from Him. He is in control. I'm not in control of my time or my labor. God is in control of it. It was an invitation to recognize God's generosity. The 6 days a week that we work, the things that we're given because we work, they come from God. They don't come from us. They come from God. It's about God's generosity. And of course, it's about God's presence. So that, I think, hopefully gives us kind of a little bit of an understanding of what Sabbath meant to the Jewish people. Of course, that's just a 5-minute little briefing on the Sabbath. But when we get to Luke chapter 6, the Pharisees are going to have some issues with Jesus. So Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 3 says, "One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, 'Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?'" So in Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 3, we find Jesus and his friends on a Sabbath day, a day of rest, a day of relaxation, a day where people aren't just kind of going about their usual 9-to-5 jobs. Rather, people are resting. And Jesus and his friends are walking through a grain field. And as they walked, Jesus' disciples were just kind of picking the heads of grain, putting them in the palm of their hand, kind of cupping it, rubbing it together, and that process would kind of separate the kernel of the grain from its outer shell, and then they would eat those exposed grains. Now, that to me it sounds like a very relaxing, restful afternoon spent with Jesus. In fact, it reminds me of when I lived in England. When I lived in England, there were times where I would walk through the barley fields near our house. And as I was walking through the fields, I would do the exact same thing that Jesus' disciples were doing. I would grab some grain with my hand, I would rub it together, and then I would just kind of pick and eat the kernels of grain. And it was relaxing. It was kind of just restful. There was nothing taxing or tedious about it. And that's what Jesus was doing with his disciples. Now, up until now, we know from what we've read that Jesus' life, Jesus' ministry has been kind of a whirlwind. We have seen Jesus traveling here and there, preaching and teaching about the kingdom of God, healing and driving out demons, and usually with a substantial crowd of people pressing in on him. Jesus was a busy person, and like anybody who's in high demand, Jesus is very much kind of in this cycle of working and hustling and running about to and fro. But on this day and on this Sabbath, Jesus is resting with his friends. He is walking through a grain field, and really just, you can imagine that they were just talking and laughing, and that it was just a restful day. And so you might think that Jesus, being God's own son, that he wouldn't need times to rest or to relax. But little glimpses in the Gospels remind us that Jesus, like all of us, like all human beings, need downtime, need to escape the rat race. And, sometimes he would go to lonely places to pray, but in this picture, he's spending time with his friends doing absolutely nothing of importance. And I love that. In this moment, Jesus has no mission, no motive, no place that he has to be. Have you ever done that? Just spent time with somebody where there wasn't like a time limit or a time frame. There wasn't anywhere that you had to go or show up to. There wasn't anything really going on, and you were just kind of shooting the breeze, killing time, not doing anything. And sometimes that can be so relaxing. Sometimes that can be so restful. It can be good for your soul. And in this beautiful moment, a group of Pharisees pops up. Just like seemingly out of nowhere, a group of Pharisees kind of just like raises, you can imagine them like raising up from amidst the sheaves of grain. Like, whoa, where did you guys come from? And it says, some of the Pharisees asked, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? And so it's just like, out of nowhere, these Pharisees just pop up. And it makes you wonder, how did they find Jesus? Were they tracking him? Were they spying on Jesus? Did they follow him there? Where did these guys come from? And of course, they're pointing out that in their opinion, Jesus and his disciples are doing something that is unlawful on the Sabbath. Well, here's how Jesus responds to that. He says in verse 3, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, taking the consecrated bread or the bread of presence. He ate what is lawful only for the priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions. Then Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So Jesus' response is to make a reference to a story about King David that is found in 1 Samuel chapter 21. And I'll just kind of summarize that. But David and his men are running away from King Saul, and they are hungry. They don't have any food. Maybe they didn't have time to bring food with them because David is fleeing from Saul. Well, David goes to a place called Nob, where there is a priest, and maybe the tabernacle was there. And he asks this priest of Nob for some bread. Now the priest doesn't have any normal bread. All he has is consecrated bread, also known as the showbread or the bread of presence. Now this bread was special because it was made for use in the tabernacle, in the holy place, to be put in God's presence as an offering to God. After it remained there for some time, it would be taken out of God's presence, and only the priests and the Levites could eat it, according to the law. Well, in the story, David and his men are given that bread, and they take it and they eat it, and the priest was okay with that. David was okay with that. And the way that Jesus tells the story, Jesus seems to be okay with that. And he clarifies his point by stating, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. AKA, the Messiah is in charge. The Messiah is the one who kind of sets the tone for what happens on the Sabbath, for what's right and wrong, for what is okay and what's not okay. In Mark's version of the story, Jesus states that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So Jesus, of course, is making a reference to a Bible story that the Pharisees would have been very familiar with. And Jesus knows that the Pharisees are not going to raise a charge against King David because they respected him as the Holy One, the chosen one of Israel. They weren't going to say that David broke the law. And so Jesus is saying, I'm the Son of Man. I am Lord of the Sabbath, the same way that David was. So you really can't bring a charge against me and my disciples. But I want to point out some words that Jesus uses as he tells the story that kind of jump out at me there. Jesus says and uses these words: companions, hungry, house of God, bread of presence. And to me, these words paint a picture that I think kind of gets to the heart of the concept of Sabbath. It is recognition that we are God's companions. You know, during the week as we're working and we're going about our daily lives, we can kind of forget that we are going through life with God by our side. We can kind of feel alone. But in reality, we are God's companions. We are his friends. Sabbath, it's about slowing down to recognize that we don't just have a hunger for food, but that deep within, there's something that food doesn't satisfy, and that's a hunger for God. Sabbath, it's kind of about recognizing a desire to enter into God's house to seek his presence. And maybe I'm over-spiritualizing Jesus' story here, because Jesus is just telling the Pharisees, hey, you can't really bring a charge against me and my disciples. The same way you can't bring a charge against David and his men when they entered into the house of God and ate the bread of presence. Jesus is saying their intentions were good. Our intentions are good. Maybe I'm over-spiritualizing what Jesus is saying here, but those are the words that jumped out at me. Well, Jesus isn't breaking the Mosaic law. What he's breaking is the Pharisees' made-up law. The rabbinical law, which was really not a law, but a tradition. And something that the Pharisees held dearly and held everybody else to, a standard that they held everybody else to, but that wasn't actually a standard found in the Mosaic law. In the Pharisees holding such a nuanced view of the Sabbath, they had taken what was meant to be a time of rest and relaxation, and they had turned it into a lot of work. You weren't allowed to walk with your friends through a grain field, shooting the breeze, enjoying each other's presence, picking a little bit of grain and eating that. You couldn't do that. They had turned what was meant to be a time of rest, turned it into a lot of work. Instead of it being about God's presence and resting in God's presence, they made it about their performance, completely missing the point. Well, this little Sabbath day run-in with the Pharisees won't be the last. In fact, immediately after this, Luke tells us of another encounter that Jesus has with the Pharisees on a Sabbath day. Verse 6, on another Sabbath he went into the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. But Jesus knew what they were thinking and said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Get up and stand in front of everyone." So he got up and stood there. And then Jesus said to them, "I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it?" He looked around at them all and then said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was completely restored. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. So they're in the synagogue. Jesus has been teaching. Everyone would have been sitting around Jesus, and Jesus, as a teacher, would have been sitting also, as was the custom. There's a man present whose right hand is shriveled. Now, according to some studies, 85 to 90% of people in the world are right-handed. And so this probably meant that it was this man's dominant hand that was shriveled. Therefore, he couldn't use it to work, which meant he didn't lead a normal life. This affected who he was and what he could do. Well, the Pharisees knew that Jesus had a tendency to heal people even on the Sabbath, and they considered that to be work. Even though, if you notice in this story, Jesus doesn't touch the man or have any kind of physical interaction with the man. He just simply tells the man to stretch out your hand. So obviously this isn't work, but the Pharisees were looking for any reason to bring a charge against Jesus, and they would have considered it to be work. Well, Jesus asks them this pointed question. He says, what's really lawful? To do good or to do bad on the Sabbath? To heal someone or to hurt someone? To save a life or to destroy one? Well, Jesus heals the man. The answer is obvious. What's lawful is to do good, to heal, to help, to save and restore. And the man's hand is completely restored. And ironically, the Pharisees begin at that very moment to do what's unlawful on the Sabbath. They begin to plot and plan, find a way to destroy Jesus' life. On the Sabbath, no less. And so it seems like Jesus' concept of Sabbath is a day of prioritizing gentle rest in God's presence and doing good to others. Concepts that the Pharisees hadn't understood, because instead of the Sabbath being about rest, to them it was about rules. Instead of being about enjoying God's presence, it was about showing off their performance. Not about what they could do, but about what they didn't do. Now, as Christians, let's kind of make this personal. As Christians, is there anything that we participate in that is meant to be restful, joyful, to draw us closer to God, and to do good to others, to encourage others? But the way that we go about it turns it into something that is more akin to work, a tedious task, a performance, something that maybe separates us from others, and in that process actually pushes us further away from God. Now here's where I think, I'm not saying that we do this, but I'm saying that it's a risk that we can run if we're not careful about our concept. I think we run the risk of making our Sunday morning worship service, commonly referred to as church, into something like this, where it's more about doing the right things in the right way, in the right order, so that we can be seen as doing it like that. And it becomes more about us and less about God. It becomes more about our performance and less about God's presence. It becomes more about what we're doing instead of about us resting in God's grace. And of course, we don't celebrate the Sabbath because in the Christian faith, the Sabbath day, and I'm taking this quote from Walter Brueggemann, the Sabbath day has been transposed from Saturday to Sunday in order to center the day as an Easter festival, right? We're celebrating the day that the Lord rose from the grave. But we might ask ourselves, how are we doing church? Is it a time of rest in God's presence, or has it become something else? Jesus rose from the grave on a Sunday. And that's why we call it the Lord's Day. It is a day that we should celebrate to the Lord. And it's a day where we're invited not just to find rest, but to find life in Him. And so as we extract ourselves from the 6 days a week where we are busy and preoccupied and prioritizing doing, let's remember that on Sundays we get together to celebrate the Lord's Day, take the Lord's Supper with the Lord's body, and that should be a time of rest in God's presence, a time of restoration in God's presence, And we need to be careful not to turn it into something that it's not intended to be. Kind of like the Pharisees who had taken the Sabbath, taken it from being something beautiful and had turned it into something burdensome. Because what God truly wants for us is to come to Jesus to find rest for our souls. Let's help each other in that process. Blessings.